explaining the Opium Wars. In the 16th century, direct trade between Europeans and the Chinese would begin. However, the Europeans were limited to the city of Canton and were forced to trade with the Kohong, a Chinese merchant group. Chinese products, like tea, were sold for silver, and this would create a trade deficit in the 18th century for the Europeans. To counter the imbalance, the British East India Company would begin selling Indian-grown opium to the Chinese. Initially, Chinese officials would accept the trade because of taxes and bribes, but in the 1830s, millions had become addicts, and the flow of silver had turned in the British's favor. Because of this, in 1839, the Daoguang Emperor would task Lin Jie-shu with stopping the trade. Lin would close the routes to Canton, blockading the British within the city, and would board British merchant vessels. The British merchants were told by the British government to hand over the opium in exchange for promised reparations. Lin would go on to destroy the opium and reopen trade with the British. However, Lin would attempt to get the merchants to sign an agreement saying that they wouldn't trade in opium or risk facing death. Some traders would agree to this, but the British government, favoring free trade, would refuse to acknowledge the agreement and would even say that the Chinese should pay reparations to their traders. In November of 1839, the Royal Navy would fire warning shots at a British merchant vessel trying to trade with China. The Chinese would send out their own navy to protect the ship, but they were crushed by the technologically superior British Navy. Despite many in the British government arguing over the moral grounds of the opium trade, the British would declare war on China in 1840. In June of 1840, a British naval force would blockade the Pearl River in the south, while another British naval force would head up north to demand compensation from the Qing. This fleet would easily be able to capture Chusan and Tianjin and relay their demands to the emperor. The Chinese would attempt to sue for peace in late 1840, but the demands of secession of an island, more trade ports, and reparations were just too much for the Chinese. So, in January of 1841, the British attacked and won a quick battle at Chunpei and threatened Canton itself. The new governor of Guangdong would agree to give the British Hong Kong and a relatively uninhabited island, but the emperor would reject this, forcing the British to increase their war efforts once again. The British would then accept money from the officials of Canton in exchange for peace, and then, over the next year, the British would sail north, taking multiple coastal cities. The Chinese would have to admit defeat, given to British demands, and would sign the Treaty of Nanjing, bringing the First Opium War to its end. 5 cities would be opened up to trade, reparations would be paid, opium would continue to be sold, and Hong Kong was given to the British. After the war, the Chinese would be forced to sign a series of unequal treaties with Western powers. However, the British still sought more out of China because they wanted Chinese cities to become open to trade and for opium to be legalized, so they looked for a way to declare war. In 1856, the Chinese crew of the Arrow, which was registered in Hong Kong, would be arrested for smuggling, giving the British a way to declare war. Once again, in November, the British would defeat the Chinese at Pearl River, and the Chinese would make a mistake firing at American ships, forcing them to retaliate, although it was brief. The British would lose their momentum, however, when a rebellion in India happened, but the British would be able to gain the support of the French. Hostilities would return in late 1857, when the Western Alliance would quickly take Canton. Then, in May of 1858, they would bombard the Taku forts in the north and take Tianjin. This would force the new Jianfang emperor to the negotiating table. As part of the peace, more Chinese cities were opened up to trade, and, inside of Beijing, legations were opened up for the British, French, and Americans. However, a year after signing the treaty, the Western powers would gain word that the emperor was going to deny them entry to Beijing to set up their legations. The Western powers would once again attack the Taku forts, but this would end in a humiliating defeat for them as they attacked at low tide. They would attack the forts again in August of 1860 and capture them. The Allies would then begin marching to Beijing, but the envoys that marched ahead of them would be captured by the Chinese and tortured. Angered by this, the Allies would force their way into Beijing and burn the Summer Palace to the ground. From there, the Chinese would sign the Convention of Peking, promising more freedom to foreigners. In conclusion, The Opium Wars was a long conflict between Western powers and China. After the wars, the Westerners would help the Chinese during the Taiping Rebellion and help with their much-needed modernization of their army. These wars are also notable for being the start of the Qing dynasty's century of humiliation. Thank you for watching this video on the Opium Wars.